Alright, so I did my presentation on the stages of death and what someone may be experiencing at the end of life. So the different stages of death begin with denial, which is essentially a defense mechanism to protect them from the inevitable or whatever diagnosis they're dealing with. This can be followed by anger, which is expressed by short temper or low patience for whatever care they're being given in a hospital setting or hospice, for example. The next stage is bargaining, which is when a patient seeks some sort of control over their illness, which means they probably give in more to the care they're being provided, and they might think, oh, this isn't as bad as I thought it would be. These first three stages are essentially an unconscious effort to protect themselves from these sad feelings that they eventually start to experience and recognize in the fourth stage, which is depression, when all of these emotions that they've been avoiding finally come out and they start to feel sad about the dying process. The final stage, acceptance, means the patient is no longer protesting but accepting the reality of their situation and or their diagnosis. And it's also important to note that these stages, they could be different for everyone. Not everyone goes through each stage or in this exact order. So next, take into consideration Erikson's stages of development. We try to look at what stage they might be in and if they're in the final stage or not. For example, if a young adult were dying, they might be facing the stage of intimacy versus isolation. And when they're in the stage in the final moments of their life, they might start thinking back on a conflict that hadn't been fully resolved to their satisfaction. Most likely what will happen if they're in the middle and not closer to the end, they may just skip stages no matter where they are to deal with the final stage, which is ego integrity versus despair. And when an individual has fulfilled the last stage, they have gained wisdom, which essentially means they're content with their life, and when facing death, they're less concerned with the life and that they lived and if they've achieved everything that they wanted to. If someone hasn't achieved integrity in the final stage, they experience despair, which is signified by fear of death. And if someone has had healthy resolutions to previous issues, they won't be thinking about that in their final stages, and this means they have achieved ego integrity instead of despair, and they won't be as afraid of the end of their life. So when we compare the beginning of life to the end of life, there's a lot of similarities and differences. For example, at the beginning of life, nutrition is very important for a new child, and they need the correct nutrients to grow and to survive, and they need to learn a lot of new things, and they will soak up all this new information like a sponge, and they're also in need of constant care because they aren't able to do a lot of things for themselves. And so a dying person may experience most of the same things because it's almost like going in reverse, so they won't be able to feed themselves like they used to. They won't be able to learn a bunch of new things, and they'll start to lose memory or consciousness, and they won't be able to soak up all this new information like a younger person would be able to. And they also need constant care because they aren't able to do things for themselves. So when we compare the beginning of life to the end of life, mothers who have just given birth require a lot of help because they are going through a new experience, and they may not know everything about it and when it comes to taking care of a new child. So if you compare this to the end, in a hospital, nurses and doctors check on dying patients less frequently and explain less to the patients because they aren't fully able to understand everything that is going on and accept that they won't be alive for much longer. And visitors in some hospitals aren't allowed as often because the patients who are dying are less conscious and aware of what's going on. Alright, so I just put some questions at the end that might come up. So the first one, what type of specialized care is available for individuals who are near death? So I found some information on hospice, which is palliative care or specialized care given to dying patients and can even include their family members. So I read that it's mainly for people with slightly higher incomes, and hospice doesn't actually get around to every dying patient, which is unfortunate because, in my opinion, it's the best option for near end of life. So it's usually only given to people who have 6 or less months to live, which can be hard to predict because obviously dying isn't predicted very accurately sometimes. So hospice care involves the use of pain medications with no dosages or specific times for when they are given, unlike in hospitals when someone would ask for more pain medication. The doctor or nurse may say that may cause an overdose or you may not need it. And they also have, in hospice, no specific times for when the pain medication is given. It's given whenever the patient asks for it. The patient is also able to take walks outside and leave their bed if they're able to move to see outside and go for a walk. They receive special foods and not just subject to a certain diet, like they may be in a hospital. And families also allowed to visit at whatever time in the day because there's no set schedule for hospice care. I also read that it may reduce a lot of stress or even extend the life of a patient, and about 16% of hospice patients are discharged alive because they got better unexpectedly. So in my opinion, I feel like hospice should be more available to all near-death patients. The next question, when is euthanasia an option or just euthanasia in general? So some states, euthanasia is an option, and there are actually 2 types of euthanasia. There's passive and active. So passive euthanasia means no extra measures are taken to extend the life of a dying patient in a hospital, similar to a do not resuscitate order, or they may not be given as much pain medication, or they may not use any tubes or anything to keep their lungs and hearts functioning. And active euthanasia is the one that we commonly know when a patient receives physician assistance for the act of ending their life with lethal injection or anything similar to that. And this is only allowed if the patient has 6 months or less to live. They are not experiencing any mental problems like depression. They have a non-curable illness, and they have to physically say that they want this route 2 times and have it written down on paper once. And so the last question, what happens after death? So I couldn't find exactly what I wanted for this question, so I just found a video that kind of explains what someone's death experience was like. Sorry, I don't have this already pulled up, so I have to type it in.
We're so glad you hang with us through the show, but this story for sure, a Texas teenager sharing a deeply personal story tonight of dying, seeing Jesus, and then coming back to life.
And he is describing what he saw and heard during those minutes without oxygen.
CBS 11's Ken Molestina with an exclusive tonight.
Zach Clements is a strong teenager. He's a high school football player at Victory Life Academy in Brownwood, Texas, and obviously he's got a sense of humor. By all measures, he's a healthy young man, which is why it's still a shock
I was running and I had collapsed.
that he dropped to the ground during PE class last week.
Not sure why.
It was a sudden cardiac arrest, according to his doctors. His mother was immediately called and even beat the ambulance to the emergency room.
When they opened the ambulance door, he was blue, and they were on top of him doing chest compressions.
Technically and medically, he was dead.
And they said that I was without a heartbeat for 20 minutes.
And just as hospital staff were ready to make it official, they got a pulse. He was airlifted to Cook Children's Hospital in Fort Worth and woke up days later. His recovery has been incredible, but even more mind-blowing is the story he tells of what he saw during the time many believed he had died.
I saw a man that had longish kind of ruffled hair with a kind of thick beard, and it didn't take me long to realize that that was Jesus.
He's describing what his family is convinced was a near-death miracle.
I went up to him and he put his hand on my shoulder and told me that everything will be all right and not to worry. I was just calm and just at peace.
The cynics out there will say, you've seen too many movies.
And for him to wake up and tell us something that he experienced like that, it's just, I mean, you can't explain it. It's not humanly possible to explain it.
Billy Clements is the teen's father. He says accepting his son's experience as a miracle is the only thing that makes sense.
And that's what we're standing on. That was a rhema word from God that we got, and we're going to hold on to that.
Do you think this is something that might strengthen your faith?
It is. I heard angels singing in the background.
It may be a medical mystery for the doctors, but for this family, there's no question it was divine intervention.
I'm just glad he decided to let me have my baby back.
In Fort Worth, Ken Molestina, CBS 11 News.
20 minutes. Wrap your head around that.
So I think that this video is very interesting. One, because it's kind of hard to find a lot of information on what happens after death, because obviously we can't experience that. We can only compare what we think may happen when we look into like physics and if the consciousness is connected to the brain or not. So I think watching videos about like what people experience and like what their different experiences were with near death, or even being physiological and literally diagnosed as dead and then coming back to life, it's just very interesting to look at. And then I just threw this last video in here about what a good end of life may look like. I'll just pull this up real quick. Hopefully that's...
We're so glad you hang with us through the show, but this...
It's the wrong video.
What would be a good end of life? And I'm talking about the very end. I'm talking about dying. We all think a lot about how to live well. I'd like to talk about increasing our chances of dying well. I'm not a geriatrician. I design reading programs for preschoolers. What I know about this topic comes from a qualitative study with a sample size of 2. In the last few years, I helped 2 friends have the end of life they wanted. Jim and Shirley Modini spent their 68 years of marriage living off the grid on their 1,700-acre ranch in the mountains of Sonoma County. They kept just enough livestock to make ends meet, so that the majority of their ranch would remain a refuge for the bears and lions and so many other things that live there. This was their dream. I met Jim and Shirley in their 80s. They were both only children who chose not to have kids. As we became friends, I became their trustee and their medical advocate, but more importantly, I became the person who managed their end-of-life experiences. And we learned a few things about how to have a good end. In their final years, Jim and Shirley faced cancers, fractures, infections, neurological illness. It's true. At the end, our bodily functions and independence are declining to 0. What we found is that with a plan and the right people, quality of life can remain high. The beginning of the end is triggered by a mortality awareness event. And during this time, Jim and Shirley chose ACR Nature Preserves to take their ranch over when they were gone. This gave them the peace of mind to move forward. It might be a diagnosis, it might be your intuition, but one day you're going to say, this thing is going to get me. Jim and Shirley spent this time letting friends know that their end was near, and that they were okay with that. Dying from cancer and dying from neurological illness are different. In both cases, last days are about quiet reassurance. Jim died first. He was conscious until the very end, but on his last day, he couldn't talk. Through his eyes, we knew when he needed to hear again, "It is all set, Jim. We're going to take care of Shirley right here at the ranch, and ACR is going to take care of your wildlife forever." From this experience, I'm going to share 5 practices. I've put worksheets online, so if you like, you can plan your own end. It starts with a plan. Most people say, "I'd like to die at home." 80% of Americans die in a hospital or a nursing home. Saying we'd like to die at home is not a plan. A lot of people say, "If I get like that, just shoot me." This is not a plan either. This is illegal. A plan involves answering straightforward questions about the end you want. Where do you want to be when you're no longer independent? What do you want in terms of medical intervention? And who's going to make sure your plan is followed? You will need advocates. Having more than one increases your chance of getting the end you want. Don't assume the natural choice is your spouse or child. You want someone who has the time and proximity to do this job well, and you want someone who can work with people under the pressure of an ever-changing situation. Hospital readiness is critical. You are likely to be headed to the emergency room, and you want to get this right. Prepare a 1-page summary of your medical history, medications, and physician information. Put this in a really bright envelope with copies of your insurance cards, your power of attorney, and your do not resuscitate order. Have advocates keep a set in their car, tape a set to your refrigerator. When you show up in the ER with this packet, your admission is streamlined in a material way. You're going to need caregivers. You'll need to assess your personality and financial situation to determine whether an elder care community or staying at home is your best choice. In either case, do not settle. We went through a number of not quite right caregivers before we found the perfect team, led by Marcia, who won't let you win at bingo just because you're dying. But we'll go out and take videos of your ranch for you when you can't get out there. And Caitlin, who won't let you skip your morning exercises but knows when you need to hear that your wife is in good hands. Finally, last words. What do you want to hear at the very end, and from whom would you like to hear it? In my experience, you'll want to hear that whatever you're worried about is going to be fine. When you believe it's okay to let go, you will. So, this is a topic that normally inspires fear and denial. What I've learned is if we put some time into planning our end of life, we have the best chance of maintaining our quality of life. Here are Jim and Shirley just after deciding who would take care of their ranch. Here's Jim just a few weeks before he died, celebrating a birthday he didn't expect to see. And here's Shirley, just a few days before she died, being read an article in that day's paper about the significance of the wildlife refuge at the Modini Ranch. Jim and Shirley had a good end of life, and by sharing their story with you, I hope to increase our chances of doing the same. Thank you.
So I think this video is really interesting because it can show us like the end stages of life and what a dying patient really goes through, and how not everyone's end of life is the same, and we can go through different things and experience different ends of life. And also important to know that not everyone gets the chance to have a good end of life or gets to choose like what they go through. And this video really shows how we can plan out what a good end of life would look like if we had the time for it. And